In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history was already underway. But for many American soldiers heading toward Omaha Beach, the reality of what awaited them was still unclear. The plan had been carefully prepared for months. Allied forces would land across multiple beaches in Normandy, overwhelm German defenses, and begin the long push into occupied France. On paper, it was a coordinated and powerful operation. But as the first waves of American troops approached Omaha Beach, the situation began to unravel. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course, units became scattered, and carefully assigned objectives started to lose meaning before the soldiers had even reached shore. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, many men were met immediately with intense machine gun fire from well-fortified German positions high above the beach. Others never made it that far. Some landing craft were hit before reaching shore, forcing soldiers to jump into deep water under heavy fire, weighed down by equipment. Within minutes, what had been planned as an organized assault turned into chaos. The beach itself offered almost no protection. Wide stretches of open sand left soldiers exposed, with only scattered obstacles and shallow depressions providing minimal cover. German defenses positioned on cliffs overlooking the beach had a clear line of sight. Every movement was visible. Every attempt to advance was met with concentrated fire. Tanks that were supposed to support the infantry either sank before reaching shore or were destroyed shortly after landing. Communication broke down almost immediately. As officers were killed, units were separated, and radio equipment was lost or damaged. For many soldiers, there were no clear orders, only the immediate need to survive. Men took cover behind whatever they could find: steel obstacles, fallen comrades, or small ridges in the sand. The noise was constant. Gunfire, explosions, shouted, commands that often went unheard. Smoke and sand filled the air, reducing visibility and adding to the confusion. What had been expected to be a difficult landing was now becoming something far worse. Entire sections of the beach were pinned down, unable to move forward or retreat. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and without decisive action, the assault risked collapsing entirely before it had even begun. Amid this chaos, leadership became critical. With so many units disorganized and many officers lost in the opening minutes, the battle began to depend on individuals who could bring some level of order to the confusion. Among them was Brigadier General Norman Cota, a senior officer who had landed with the early waves. Unlike many commanders who remained further from the front, Cota moved directly into the most dangerous areas of the beach, where the situation was at its worst. He saw firsthand that soldiers were pinned down, unsure of what to do next and unable to advance, under the heavy fire coming from above. Rather than waiting for orders or reinforcements, he began moving along the beach, speaking directly to the men, urging them to push forward. His presence alone began to have an effect. In a situation where fear and confusion had taken over, clear and direct leadership started to restore a sense of purpose. But even with that leadership, the challenge remained enormous. The German defenses were still intact, and every attempt to move off the beach meant crossing open ground under constant fire. The longer the soldiers remained pinned down, the more vulnerable they became. Time was working against them. Reinforcements continued to arrive, but instead of strengthening the assault, they added to the congestion on the beach, increasing the number of exposed targets. The situation had reached a critical point. If the Americans could not break through the defenses soon, The entire operation at Omaha Beach could fail. What happened next would determine not just the fate of the soldiers on that beach, but the success of D-Day itself. As the morning wore on, the situation on Omaha Beach remained critical. The initial assault had failed to achieve its objectives, and large sections of the shoreline were still under heavy German control. Waves of American reinforcements continued to arrive, but instead of advancing inland, many found themselves trapped on the narrow strip of sand, unable to move forward. The beach became increasingly crowded, with wounded soldiers, damaged equipment, and destroyed landing craft scattered across the shoreline. German machine gun nests, positioned in fortified bunkers and hidden strong points along the cliffs, continued to fire with precision. Every attempt to cross the open ground was met with immediate resistance. Engineers, tasked with clearing obstacles, struggled to do their work under constant fire, while medics moved from one casualty to another, often exposed as they tried to reach the wounded. The plan that had relied on speed and coordination had broken down, replaced by isolated groups of soldiers fighting to survive in a situation that felt almost impossible to overcome. Out at sea, naval forces attempted to provide support, but even that came with limitations. Warships moved closer to the shore than originally planned, firing directly at German positions in an effort to suppress the defenses. Shells struck cliffs and bunkers, sending debris into the air, but the effectiveness of these strikes varied. Some positions were damaged or destroyed, while others remained operational, continuing to fire down onto the beach. Meanwhile, communication between the beach and command units offshore remained unreliable. Reports coming in were fragmented and often incomplete, making it difficult for commanders to fully understand the scale of the problem. What was clear, however, was that the assault had stalled. Without a breakthrough, the entire operation at Omaha Beach risked failure. The pressure to act was increasing with every passing minute. Amid this growing crisis, individual leadership began to shape the course of events. Brigadier General Norman Cota continued moving along the beach, refusing to stay behind cover for long. He moved through areas where soldiers were pinned down, speaking directly to them, urging them to reorganize and push forward. His approach was simple but effective. Focus on small groups, create momentum, and begin moving off the beach one section at a time. In one of the most well-known moments of the battle, Cota encountered elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion. Seeing that they were also pinned down, he challenged them directly, pushing them to advance despite the danger. That moment helped trigger a shift, not across the entire beach, but in specific areas where movement had completely stopped. Small groups of soldiers began to follow his lead, moving toward the base of the cliffs, searching for any path that could lead them out of the exposed shoreline. The terrain itself offered limited opportunities, but they were there. Narrow draws, small breaks in the cliffs, had been identified as key objectives, though many were still under heavy German control. Some soldiers began to move along the edges of these areas, using what little cover they could find. Others climbed over obstacles, crawled through sand and debris, or used the smoke and chaos to advance in short bursts. Progress was slow and dangerous, but it had begun. The battle was no longer completely static. What had been a stalled assault was now turning into a series of small, independent advances. Each one came with risk, and each one depended on individuals willing to move forward when everything around them suggested they should stay down. The outcome was still far from certain, but for the first time since the landings began, There were signs that the situation could change. By late morning, the battle on Omaha Beach had reached a point where survival alone was no longer enough. Remaining on the shoreline meant certain failure. The only path forward was through the German defenses above the cliffs, and that meant advancing into the most heavily defended positions on the entire beach. Small groups of American soldiers, many from different units that had been mixed together in the chaos, began organizing themselves into makeshift assault teams. Without clear orders or structured command, these men relied on instinct, experience, and whatever leadership emerged among them. Engineers, infantry, and rangers worked side by side, using explosives, rifles, and sheer determination to move forward. They advanced in short bursts, often crawling or running from one piece of cover to the next, always under the threat of machine gun fire from above. The terrain made everything more difficult. Steep slopes, loose sand, and scattered obstacles slowed movement, while German defenders continued to fire from well-concealed positions. Every meter gained came at a cost. Brigadier General Norman Cota remained close to the front, continuing to push soldiers toward the cliffs. His presence helped create a sense of direction in a situation where formal command structures had largely broken down. Rather than focusing on large-scale coordination, the effort shifted to localized breakthroughs. If even a few groups could reach the top of the cliffs, they could begin attacking German positions from behind, reducing the pressure on the beach below. That idea began to take shape as soldiers found weak points in the defenses. Some used Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps through barbed wire, while others climbed through narrow gullies or followed natural breaks in the terrain that were less heavily defended. These routes were not safe, but they offered a chance. One by one, small groups began reaching higher ground. Once there, the nature of the fight changed. Instead of being pinned down, they could move laterally, targeting German bunkers and machine gun nests from angles the defenders had not expected. The impact of these breakthroughs was gradual but significant. As German positions were attacked from behind or from the flanks, their effectiveness began to decline. Some bunkers were destroyed, others were abandoned as defenders were forced to reposition or retreat. The intense, concentrated fire that had dominated the beach earlier in the morning started to weaken in certain areas. This created new opportunities for additional soldiers to move off the shoreline. Reinforcements, which had previously been trapped on the sand, could now begin advancing inland through the same paths that had been opened by the first groups. The battle was still dangerous, and resistance remained strong, but the dynamic had shifted. The beach was no longer a static killing zone. It was becoming a point of departure. Even so, the situation remained fragile. The success of these advances depended on maintaining momentum. If the movement stalled again, the German defenders could reorganize and regain control of the high ground. Communication was still limited. Coordination between units remained difficult, and many soldiers were operating with little understanding of the broader situation. Yet, despite these challenges, the change was undeniable. What had begun as a near collapse was turning into a hard-fought breakthrough. The men who had made it off the beach were now carrying the battle forward, creating space for others to follow. It was not a clean or organized advance, but it was enough. For the first time that day, the outcome at Omaha Beach was no longer defined by failure. It was beginning to be shaped by possibility. As more American soldiers reached the top of the cliffs, the battle began to shift in a way that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. What had started as scattered, uncoordinated advances now began to connect into something more structured. Small groups that had broken through German defenses started linking up, sharing information, and identifying remaining strongpoints that still threatened the beach below. From their new positions, they could see what had been hidden from the shoreline, the layout of bunkers, trenches, and defensive positions that had caused so much damage during the initial landings. This change in perspective was critical. Instead of attacking blindly into fortified positions, American troops could now move with greater purpose, targeting specific threats and reducing the effectiveness of the German defenses one position at a time. The fight was still intense, but it was no longer one-sided. Below, on the beach, the impact of these breakthroughs became increasingly visible. The volume of incoming fire began to decrease in certain sectors, allowing more soldiers to move off the exposed sand and follow the paths that had been opened. Engineers resumed clearing obstacles, medics could operate with slightly less risk, and units that had been pinned down for hours finally found opportunities to advance. Naval gunfire, which had continued throughout the morning, now became more effective as observers could direct it toward identified targets inland. Each successful movement off the beach reduced the pressure on those still landing, creating a gradual but steady improvement in the overall situation. It was not a sudden victory, but a slow shift, one that depended on continuous effort and the ability to maintain momentum under constant threat. Brigadier General Norman Cota continued to play a key role in sustaining that momentum. He moved between units, reinforcing the need to keep pushing forward and not allow the advance to stall. His leadership helped ensure that the early breakthroughs did not remain isolated successes but became part of a broader movement inland. Rather than consolidating too quickly or waiting for full organization, the emphasis remained on progress, gaining ground, disrupting enemy positions, and preventing German forces from regaining control. This approach carried risks, but it also prevented the kind of delay that had nearly caused the operation to fail earlier in the day. Every position taken, no matter how small, contributed to the larger effort. For the German defenders, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Their initial advantage, clear lines of fire, and well-prepared positions was being eroded. As American forces moved onto higher ground, German units were forced to adapt, often under pressure and with limited communication. Some positions held and continued to resist, but others were abandoned as the threat from multiple directions grew. The defensive structure that had seemed so effective at the start of the battle was beginning to break apart. What had once been a coordinated defense was turning into a series of isolated engagements, each one harder to sustain than the last. By early afternoon, the outcome at Omaha Beach was no longer in immediate doubt, but the cost had been high. Casualties were significant, and the terrain was still dangerous. Yet, despite everything that had gone wrong in the opening hours, American forces had managed to turn the situation around. The beach had been secured enough to allow continued landings, and the advance inland had begun. The chaos of the morning had not disappeared, but it had been transformed. What remained was the task of pushing further into occupied territory, building on the hard-won ground, and ensuring that the sacrifices made on the beach had not been in vain. By the late afternoon of June 6, 1944, the situation on Omaha Beach had changed completely from the chaos of the early morning. What had begun as one of the most dangerous and uncertain assaults of the entire D-Day invasion was now a foothold, fragile, costly, but firmly established. American forces had secured enough ground to allow continued landings, and more troops, vehicles, and supplies were beginning to move inland. The German defenses that had once dominated the beach were no longer in full control. While resistance remained in pockets, the overall structure of the defense had been broken. The cliffs that had seemed impossible to take just hours earlier were now occupied by American troops. From these positions they could push further into Normandy, linking up with other Allied forces and expanding the beachhead. The immediate danger had not disappeared, but the moment of greatest risk had passed. The cost of that success, however, was impossible to ignore. The beach was still covered with the remains of the morning's fighting, destroyed equipment, damaged landing craft, and the fallen soldiers who had not made it past the shoreline. For those who survived, the memory of those first hours would never fade. The scale of the losses reflected just how close the operation had come to failure. If the troops had remained pinned down, if the breakthroughs at the cliffs had not occurred, or if leadership had failed in those critical moments, Omaha Beach could have become a disaster that threatened the entire invasion. Instead, it became one of the most hard-fought successes of D-Day. The difference came down to persistence, small unit action, and individuals who refused to accept the situation as it was. Among those individuals, Brigadier General Norman Cota stood out, not because he controlled every movement on the battlefield, but because he influenced the direction of the fight when it mattered most. His decision to move forward, to engage directly with soldiers under fire, and to push them beyond the point where many had lost hope, helped transform the outcome of the battle. He did not act alone, and the victory was not the result of one person, but his role captured something essential about Omaha Beach: leadership at the point of crisis. When structure broke down and plans failed, it was the ability to act in the moment that determined what would happen next. Beyond Omaha Beach, the success of D-Day continued to unfold. Other landing zones had achieved their objectives with varying degrees of difficulty, and Allied forces were now establishing a continuous front across Normandy. The invasion of Western Europe had begun in earnest. What followed would be a long and difficult campaign, with heavy fighting still ahead, but the foundation had been set. The beaches had been taken, the first lines had been broken, and the path into occupied France was open. Omaha Beach, once the most uncertain point of the entire operation, had become part of that success. Looking back, the events of that day reveal how quickly war can move from control to chaos, and how fragile even the most carefully planned operations can be. But they also show how outcomes can change when individuals act under pressure, when small advances build into larger breakthroughs, and when determination holds long enough for the situation to turn. Omaha Beach was not a perfect operation. It was a battle that nearly failed. Yet it stands as a defining moment, not because everything went according to plan, but because, in the face of overwhelming difficulty, it did not collapse,